and welcome to this webinar presenting the 2020 edition of the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. My name is Lars Christiansen. I'm the Senior Project Officer at UNEP DTU Partnership, which is a collaborating center of UNEP based at the Technical University of Denmark. The webinar will take around 90 minutes, starting with presentations of the report's main findings by a number of lead authors. And following those presentations, we'll have a short panel discussion, and finally, we'll have an open Q&A session where you, the audience, can interact with your questions and comments. Please note that the participants can only interact in writing. You should see a small question mark in your interface, and this is where you can type in your questions for the Q&A session, as well as any practical or technical questions you may have for the webinar itself. I will be back shortly with some further introductions, but for now, I would just like to inform all of you that we comply with the General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR. This means that your personal data, such as name, email, workplace, etc., is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. For access to the data or further information, please contact with the people that are presented here on this slide. And without that out of the way, I would now like to give the floor to Niklas Hagelberg, who is the coordinator of UNEP's sub-program on climate change, for some brief welcoming remarks. Niklas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lars, and welcome to this webinar on behalf of UNEP. It's a pleasure to have you all with us, albeit it's virtual, but that's also for climate change a good way forward. The Adaptation Gap Report, alongside the Emission Gap Report, is a flagship report for UNEP with a purpose to inform and provide insights for climate negotiators and stakeholders on the latest status of climate action, and in this case, particularly planning, finance, and implementation. While on adaptation, we don't quite have the same kind of quantitative goals as we have on the mitigation side. The authors and the whole team behind the Adaptation Gap Report have done a stellar job in helping us to quantify where we are while looking at where we need to be in terms of building resilience towards climate change. And with that short welcoming note, I would like to give back to Lars and the authors to present to us the findings of the report. Lars, back to you.
Many thanks, Niklas. I would now like to make a very quick introduction to what the Adaptation Gap Report is and the outline and conceptual framing of the 2020 report. UNEP has been producing Adaptation Gap Reports since 2014, and this is the 5th edition. Since the beginning, the core objective of the Adaptation Gap Report has been to assess global adaptation gaps, form on results of global adaptation efforts. From 2020 and going forward, the Adaptation Gap Report will have a recurring 3-part structure. That is, the same basic outline will apply to all Adaptation Gap Reports to be prepared towards the first Global Stocktake in 2023. Part 1 is the core element of this recurring format and involves an assessment of progress in 3 central elements of the adaptation process: planning, financing, and implementation, with 1 chapter dedicated to each, as indicated here on this slide. Part 2 is a deep dive that is a more detailed assessment of the same 3 elements for a selected theme or sector. In 2020, the selected theme is NatureBased Solutions. The purpose of the deep dive is twofold. First, it provides a more detailed picture of progress in the selected theme or sector. And second, it adds supplementary perspectives, nuance, and detail to the overall progress assessment in the report. The theme is selected from year to year in light of global developments, international priorities, and needs of the UNFCCC. And finally, Part 3 synthesizes findings from Part 1 and 2 into a status of global adaptation progress and offers an outlook on future developments. This figure, which is taken from the report, summarizes the conceptual framing in the 2020 Adaptation Gap Report. The Adaptation Gap Report aims to assess global progress on adaptation, and progress in this report is understood at 2 distinct levels of analysis. First, progress can be considered in the context of outputs from the adaptation process, that is the sum of activities engaged in to help achieve adaptation objectives. This basically corresponds to answering the question, what are we doing to adapt today? While it's by no means a straightforward or trivial methodological exercise to answer this question, data generally allows a relatively comprehensive picture of progress at the output level. However, assessment of adaptation outputs can only provide a preliminary part of the progress story. The big question, of course, is to what extent are we actually reducing climate risk levels today and in the future? Or to put it in a different way, is our progress and outputs actually translating to outcomes? And are those outcomes adequate considering the magnitude of impact expected? Such outcomes can be further split in two, as indicated in this figure. Observed outcomes, that is the outcomes that we can observe already today, and the expected outcomes, that is the outcomes that we are expecting from currently planned adaptation efforts in the future. Outcomes are unfortunately much more tricky to quantify with current methodologies, and assessment of outcomes in the Adaptation Gap Report is therefore, at least for the time being, only possible to a limited extent and more qualitatively than what is possible for outputs. Our hope is that future adaptation gap reports will be able to go further, both in terms of improving methodologies and scope of data for the output assessment, but also in terms of increasingly providing better outcome assessments, including more quantitative assessments of outcomes. And finally, just before handing over to presentations of key findings from the report, let me again remind you that if you have any questions or comments for the presentations or for the panel that comes after that, you can ask these in writing using the interface found by the small question mark. And you can do that at any time during the presentation, so just feel free to go ahead. We will monitor these questions and try to include as many as we can in the Q&A session coming later. But of course, since there's a lot of participants here, we can't guarantee that all questions will be answered. And with that very short introduction, let me hand over to Annette Møhner, who is from the Adaptation Division at UNFCCC. Annette was a lead author of the planning chapter and will present the key findings on progress on adaptation planning. Over to you, Annette.
Thank you very much, Lars. As mentioned, I would like to give you a short overview of Chapter 3, which focuses on global progress on adaptation planning. As some of you may recall, the 2015 Paris Agreement put a particular importance on national level adaptation planning. At the same time, parties agreed to review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation as part of its Global Stocktake, which will commence in 2023. However, at this time, we don't have an agreed methodology for such a review. And as Niklas already highlighted, we also haven't quantified the global goal yet. In order to provide some assessment on where we are in adaptation planning, we looked at existing framework and indicators to allow for a quantitative and qualitative review of planning instruments for 196 countries along 5 criteria. We chose those 5 criteria because we think they allow us to assess whether or not adaptation planning is adequate, meaning sufficient and effective in a sense of being successful in achieving its targets and objectives. The criteria you'll see in the table on the right-hand side, they comprise comprehensiveness, inclusiveness, implementability, integration, and finally, monitoring and evaluation. So what have we seen? In terms of quantity, there has been significant progress in adaptation planning since 2000. As of today, 72% of countries have at least one national level adaptation planning instrument in place that can be a plan, but also policy or law. We've also seen 125 developing countries have begun a process of formulating and implementing a national adaptation plan. Out of those, 20 have already completed their NAP. And finally, we also have around 58% of countries that have established sectoral adaptation plans and around 21 having subnational planning instruments. Unfortunately, that quantitative progress is not matched with the quality and hence likely success of adaptation planning. When we look at the 5 criteria, while more than half meet the criteria for comprehensiveness and most of them engage stakeholders, the scoring on the other indicators is lower. In terms of implementability and monitoring and evaluation, the scoring is so low that the successful implementation of those plans are in jeopardy, given that there are little regulatory instruments, little incentive-based instruments, and not sufficient direct investment and funding. In terms of the integration, how well is adaptation planning integrated across other policy fields? We have a relatively good picture when it comes to horizontal integration. As mentioned, we do have sectoral plans, however, not so well when it comes to vertical integration. That is, national plans aren't necessarily being reflected in subnational plans, local plans. And finally, one thing we've noticed, of course, parties are still in the process of submitting better and more information under the Paris Agreement, in particular in preparation for the Global Stocktake. And as more information, in particular consistent information, is being submitted, we expect a more nuanced analysis in the coming Global Gaps reports. And who knows, there may also be some further refinement of the global goal, which will allow some further analysis. With those short words, I would like to thank you very much and hand back to Lars.
Many thanks, Annette, and thank you for keeping very tight time here. Well done. I'm now going to hand over to Peter Pau from the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. And Peter was the lead author on the finance chapter of the report and will present the key findings on financing for adaptation.
Yes, thank you, Lars. It's my pleasure to be here and to present this report also on behalf of my co-authors. Basically, what we describe in the report and what we find out is that when we look at two components, of course, costs, estimated costs, and estimated finance. And the costs are estimated to rise, adaptation costs. The costs are rising to an estimated level of 140 to 300 billion per year by 2030 in developing countries alone. And costs are likely to rise further after that, depending on how climate change evolves. Costs in industrialized countries are higher. Think of, for example, the inflatable flood barrier for Venice alone costs over 5 billion, but the costs per GDP are expected to be higher in developing countries. It's very difficult to quantify how much finance or to estimate how much finance there actually is for adaptation to address these costs. We know most about international public adaptation finance, so the support from developed to developing countries, and we see that this is increasing over time. Although the share of overall international flows, so relative also part of ODA, remains small. So it's only 14.6% that goes to from multilateral sources and only 6.1% of bilateral support. The second source, domestic finance, we can, in line with the presentation by Annette Meuner of the UNFCCC just now, we can expect that domestic finance is increasing, but we do not have enough data to identify a trend here. And the same accounts for private finance. We can expect a trend or an upward trend, but we simply do not have enough data here. One source, the Climate Policy Initiative, estimates adaptation finance at 30 billion per year by now, but that's only one estimate, and there are many hooks to that, to estimating adaptation finance in general. So overall, we can conclude that there's insufficient evidence that the increase in finance over time is actually narrowing the distance to meet the increasing adaptation costs. The next slide then indicates some of these uncertainties, both of estimating costs related to adaptation on the right side and estimating costs, estimating finance on the left side. These just provide some of the uncertainties, right? So the estimated cost of adaptation are, for example, uncertain because we do not know much about the socioeconomic development over the next decades. There's, of course, a trade-off. If you invest more in adaptation, you need less. If you invest more in mitigation, you need to invest less in adaptation. But if you invest less in adaptation, there will be more residual costs. And for example, the uncertainties in terms of estimating finance on the left side are related to the coverage of sectors and sources that you include, but also on the definition. What do you count as adaptation finance? And also how it is related to ODA, for example. So what is new and additional? And this figure, without spending too much time on it, but it's included in the report for your reference. Then there are a couple of interesting new trends that we can see in adaptation. So first of all, there are efforts being made by bilateral and multilateral climate finance providers to expand the number of and the types of instruments, actors, and approaches. So, for example, there's now forecast-based finance being used, results-based finance being used, loans are being used for adaptation, still at a very small scale, but this is increasing, and there is a push to be more innovative here. And the second thing, the second new trend, and this is also very important, is the increasing momentum to ensure a sustainable financial system that basically is consistent with the implementation of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. Sorry, that was too quick. So there are basically three elements here. First, the sustainability taxonomies and standards establish criteria for determining the sustainability of economic activity, and this can also help to identify and track finance flows for adaptation in the future, which is highly relevant also for this report. Second is that the financial disclosure regulations help to increase transparency in terms of the vulnerability of investments and assets, and help to change the attractiveness of investments and kind of crowd in or integrate climate risks into investment decision making. And the third element here, and that's also very important, because normally when we talk about sustainable finance, we think of the financial system, but by stimulating the mainstreaming of climate risks in the financial system, this will automatically trickle down into the real economy. So that's also a very important element here. I'd like to leave it there for now and look forward to future questions. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Peter. And I now hand it over to Timo Leiter, who is from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Timo was the lead author on the implementation chapter of the report and will present the key findings on progress on implementation. Over to you, Timo.
Thank you, Lars, and hi, everyone. So one of the innovative features of this year's Adaptation Gap Report and its new structure is to focus on actual implementation, which is, of course, essential if we aim to understand adaptation progress. And so in the implementation chapter, we have used two data sources. First, we looked at project descriptions from the three global climate funds that serve the Paris Agreement, namely the Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environment Facilities Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund. And here the report has identified those projects which are focusing explicitly and primarily on adaptation. And as a second data source, we have made use of data from the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, which is a large research collaborative with more than 100 researchers, which has scanned last year the entire literature base on articles that describe adaptation actions which have already taken place. In articles published between 2013 and 2019, they identified almost 1,700 articles. So these two data sources combined form the basis for the implementation chapter. And I'm going to present you some of the key findings in the next slides. First, on the project example, so we have identified almost 400 adaptation projects from these three funds, which are directly addressing adaptation. In addition to those, there are many projects which are cross-cutting, and they are also, and yeah, what's key is that from these 400, half of them have started since 2015, which shows a strong increase in the number of projects over the recent years. You can also see that in the diagram below, and what is essential here is that since 2017, we see a trend to larger funding volumes per each individual project, which allows potentially for the ability to more systematically address systemic climate risks. So that's a very interesting finding. And in 2020, you see that for the first time, the number of projects between 11 to 25 million US dollar has overtaken the number of smaller projects below 10 million. Another finding is what are the top sectors that are addressed most often. On the left side, you see those from the projects, and on the right side of the diagram, we've compared them with the priorities mentioned in NDCs. That is the first round of NDCs. And you can see that the top two sectors in both cases are agriculture and water. So there's a good alignment between priorities in the NDCs and those addressed by projects from these three funds. And this slide shows you the hazards that were addressed by the projects on the left side and the hazards that were identified by the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative on the right. And here again, you see that the top three hazards in both cases are drought, flooding, and rainfall variability. So this is what projects most addressed. The chapter has a number of further things it analyzes, for example, the extent to which gender aspects are considered, the extent to which projects address the most vulnerable, the extent to which ecosystem-based adaptation and climate information are considered. So you can find more details in the chapter. And finally, in terms of what were the results or the outcomes of these projects, there is very limited data on adaptation outcomes. Climate funds mainly use output level indicators, as we already found in a 2019 background paper for the Global Commission on Adaptation. And so output data is available. All of these three funds report on the number of beneficiaries and on the number of people trained, but that doesn't tell us whether outputs have actually been utilized or whether adaptation has taken place. So there's still a gap in information and knowledge on this. This has been confirmed by data from the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, where only 4% of the articles were classified as being at this stage of risk reduction. So while it's a lot of actions happening, there's limited or very limited evidence of it actually reducing climate risks. So one of the recommendations of the chapter is that for project developers to focus more closely on how the projects intend to achieve adaptation, for example, by using a theory of change. And finally, I've just posted a blog commentary on the Adaptation Gap Report, which is outlining the innovative features again, which you are welcome to have a look at LSE's website. And with that, I would like to thank you very much and hand back to Lars.
Thanks a lot for that, Timo. I now invite Manish Kadel-Mel from Columbia University and NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies to present the key findings from this year's deep dive assessment on nature-based solutions.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lars. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to present some highlights from the nature-based solutions for adaptation. As Lars mentioned, this is the focal chapter of this year's Adaptation Gap Report. And I had the opportunity to work with a wonderful group of lead authors and several contributing authors. And I'll dive right into it. So just to start, I want to focus a little bit on why the Adaptation Gap Report focused on NBS. There's growing recognition that two of the major global crises, that's climate change and biodiversity, that these are very strongly linked. There are two components to this. One is that climate change is a major driver of biodiversity loss. And on the other hand, nature has a very important role in both mitigation and adaptation. So there is a really urgent need for both policy and action to not just secure, but also harness nature's benefits. And we are seeing this recognized more and more. For example, the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly is going to focus on strengthening actions for nature to achieve sustainable development goals. And 2021 is a big year because it's also the start of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And just to sort of talk a little bit about what NBS means, it is to restore, build on, and enhance ecosystem services. This is in order to manage climate change risks and impacts and to help people adapt to climate change and also to enhance climate resilience of communities, assets, and society. Just a couple of points on biodiversity and climate risk. While these ecosystems play a very important role in NBS, unfortunately, they themselves are highly vulnerable to climate change. These risks can be addressed by accelerating mitigation, but also by carrying out climate-informed natural resource management and conservation. On the right side, there's a case example of the Mesoamerican Reef region where climate information is being integrated into adaptation planning. Commonly, NBS is applied to address 4 main types. That includes coastal hazards, intense precipitation, rising temperatures, and drought. Similar to the main structure of the Adaptation Gap Report, the NBS chapter also has focal areas on planning, financing, and implementation. So these are some of those highlights. An analysis of nationally determined contributions showed that over 60% of countries included elements of NBS in their adaptation component. A vast majority of these were least developed countries, and most of these describe broad goals, and less than a third really describe measurable targets. This map here, you can see in dark green the countries that have these NBS elements in their adaptation sections of their NDCs. Similar story with national adaptation plans. They also refer to ecosystem-based adaptation approaches, but these are also mostly broadly described. One thing that's very important, in order for NBS to be truly effective, it requires system scale approaches, and this will involve planning and coordination across various boundaries that includes national and jurisdictional boundaries. Throughout this chapter, we have case examples highlighting some good practices from across the world. One here is from St. Lucia, where the water sector adaptation strategy and action plan did use some elements that are nature-based. This includes vegetative buffers and wetlands. When it comes to financing, as you can see from the figure on the right, one of the challenges is the rather nebulous nature of nature-based solutions. This is because it nestles between climate finance and conservation finance, and both these types of financing are used for both adaptation and mitigation. And this makes gauging the current status of NBS quite challenging. There was an analysis of some of the major global funds, and the cumulative investment in adaptation projects now stand at $94 billion. Of this, about 13% contain NBS elements, but only a fraction of this is for actual implementation. The section on financing has highlighted some of the gaps and a few solutions. Some of these steps that we can use to address these gaps include diversifying and expanding the funding base, and also creating enabling conditions like regulatory frameworks. One example, which I found particularly interesting, was from Milwaukee, US, where certified climate bonds included a component of green infrastructure. There aren't many climate bonds out there that have nature, but this was one of them. Then moving on to implementation of NBS. Here I want to highlight a very comprehensive study. This was led by Henry Neufeld. He analyzed projects from various large donor databases and found that there were lots of projects that addressed underlying hazards, and intense precipitation was the most common one. This was followed by drought, rising temperature, and coastal hazards. And if you look at the Sankey diagram, you can see what these underlying hazards and how they lead to proximate hazards and what nature-based solutions are used. And on the right, you can see that a wide range of nature-based solutions are used to address these. The same analysis also showed that there was a period where there was exponential increase of NBS for adaptation, but now that's plateaued to about 70 new initiatives per year. The analysis further shows that over half of all NBS occur in rural areas, followed by urban areas and coastal areas. Another example, and there are many in the implementation section, is approaches that are used to combat forest fires in the Gambia, and that includes restoring degraded forests and establishing sustainable businesses. I want to conclude by highlighting some of the key messages from the chapter. What's encouraging is that national and international both policy and actions are increasingly recognizing that nature-based solutions play a vital role in climate change adaptation. Another major advantage of NBS is that it brings environmental, socioeconomic benefits to a wide range of stakeholders, including marginalized people, including marginalized groups. High-end climate change unfortunately poses a major challenge and can limit the effectiveness of NBS. We are seeing that adaptation plans are acknowledging both the potential of NBS to reduce climate impacts, but also the vulnerability of these ecosystems to climate change. And they are usually very broadly explained, and there's very little explicit information on climate risks and how NBS is used to tackle these. And then just the final few key messages. Only a small proportion of climate finance is currently targeted towards NBS, but there's real potential that this could be amplified, strengthened, and diversified. And this can be done by deploying innovative mechanisms like the climate bonds I exemplified earlier, and by blending various sources of funding. There is an increased level of implementation of NBS. We are currently unsure whether the trend will continue, and it's a little too early to assess the effects of these interventions. And the final point, which is one of the most important points, is that in order for NBS's potential to be fully realized, we really need to limit the risks of dangerous climate change. So mitigation is vital, and we really need to scale up ambition and action by protecting, conserving, and restoring nature. Thank you.
Alexander Magnan from IDRI.
Hi, everyone. So thank you, Lars and colleagues. So chapter 7, in this final chapter, we built on thematic and topical chapters. My colleagues presented in order to come up with some overarching messaging and findings on adaptation progress at the global scales. And we organized these findings around 3 main topics. So you have them on the left-hand side. Progress, gaps, and also a discussion around the elements that constrain the interpretation of the findings. All this information is gathered in a synthetic figure, which is on page 81 of the report. I won't go to the detail, but I will go through the main points. In terms of progress, so these conclusions, you already heard some of them in the previous presentations, but there is some convergence from one chapter to another, and it's important to remind some of these points. So the first one in terms of progress is that national level plans, strategies, frameworks, and laws, they are in place in most of the countries, although with variable degrees of maturity, but they are in place, and this is good news. Second, adaptation finance, as shown by Peter, and the number of projects, as shown by Timo, they are increasing worldwide. There is some movement towards more actionable policies. That means policies that really try to better include in their frameworks and so on, very specific measures and decisions. And in terms of measure, we had some good examples in the nature-based solution chapters of this report. And last good progress is that we see that the financial modalities, Peter talked about that, are quickly evolving with diversification of the instruments and the sources. And we also have some early signs of more climate-proof and sustainable financial systems and investments. So these are all good news, but of course there are still some gaps. I think you understood that also in the other presentations. First of all, it has been said adaptation costs are estimated increasing at a higher rate than adaptation finance. So we still lack clear evidence on that, but there is really a general agreement around this conclusion. Also, ANET showed that in terms of monitoring and evaluation systems, they are coming up, and there are some already that are in development, but still overall there is a kind of under development of these systems at the global level, while they are critical to ensure the sustainability of adaptation action. There is also a lack of evidence in terms of the knock-on effect of national level adaptation policies at the subnational levels. That means that we don't have clear evidence whether what is implemented at the national level really galvanize action and decision at the local level. There is also a limited understanding of future trends in adaptation. Planning, finance, implementation dimensions, of course. So it's hard to make some projections on future adaptation, and the way equity dimensions and including gender are considered in national level adaptation today remains unclear. And so that's a point of interest and of attention for the next reports. Also, we identified some elements that constrain the interpretation of the findings and that constrain the identification of whether we are making more progress than there are still gaps. So 4 of these barriers, the first one is related to adaptation goals, both globally and nationally. These goals, they remain insufficiently defined, so it's hard really to see, to understand what are the targets in terms of risk reduction, and so to assess progress against these targets. Also, there is poor availability of shared databases documenting planning and implementation in high-income countries, but also documenting private finance. So that means that the information most of the time exists, but it's hard to find and to gather. There are also scientific gaps. It has been said in understanding the effectiveness of local to national adaptation strategies and projects in terms of risk reduction now and in the future. And there are uncertainties surrounding the long-term effects of contextual changes. And we have a sad but a current example with the COVID-19 crisis, the effects on the long-term efforts in terms of adaptation and results, it remains a big question. So just to sum up, at the end, we can say that progress is being made for sure, but we still lack some evidence across regions, sectors, and hazards. So this is something we can improve in the future. Also, this progress, they are here, but they are estimated not occurring at the required scale. And this is particularly true when you also look in parallel to trends in climate risks. And finally, we still have conceptual, technical, and scientific limitations, especially around data and how to deal with these contextual uncertainties, such as the COVID-19 crisis and its implication on adaptation. This remains a critical point to be discussed. And that's it. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Alex. And this concludes our very quick run through of the findings from the report. And I hopefully this has piqued your interest. And we will, of course, strongly encourage you to pick up the full report, which has much more detail than what we can cover here today. And it can be found on UNEP's website. We'll now proceed to a short panel discussion. And here I will hand over to my colleague, Henry Neufeld, who is the head of the Impact Assessment and Adaptation Analysis section here at UNEP DTU Partnership. And Henry will moderate our panel discussion and Q&A session. So over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Lars, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about the Adaptation Gap Report 2020. We've heard some very interesting insights from the chapters, And now I want to move on to a panel session during which our 4 panelists will give some insights into their understanding of the Adaptation Gap Report, what it means. And so I would like to invite Annette Mörner, who is the team lead for adaptation in the adaptation division of the UNFCCC, Niklas Hagelberg, who's the coordinator of UNEP subprogram on climate change, Anna Olhoff, who's the head of strategy in climate planning and policy at the UNEP DTU partnership, and Edith Ofwona-Adair, who is the principal climate and green growth officer at the African Development Bank, to join me on this panel. And they will turn on their videos, so it's a bit like sitting in front of a normal panel, although we're all in different parts of the world. I think Edith is having difficulties to bring her video on, and we just hope that the audio works. And so I have a few questions. Now if I have to find my question sheet, that's important to avoid complications. Sorry for that. So I will just ask a question to the panel, and then maybe there's a follow-up question. And then after that, we will open up the floor for a general Q&A, which I will also moderate. And then the other speakers will also join us all on this virtual panel, and we will have questions coming from the audience to the panelists. So without further ado, I'm just going to start with Annette. So in your view, in the view of the UNFCCC, what are the main issues that need to be resolved in terms of the global stocktake in 2023? Oops.
Thanks very much, Henry, for that question. And of course, as some of you may recall, the global stocktake, the decision to take one to actually assess how far have we progressed in terms of achieving our common goals. On the one hand side, the goal of limiting temperature increase, but on the other hand, the global goal on adaptation that was enshrined in the Paris Agreement. We got some further details in 2018 with the Katowice decision. However, there are still a few loose ends that we need to tie. And you asked for 3 for adaptation. I see we need to tighten the methods of assessment. On the one hand, we need to ensure further and better input to allow the assessment. And finally, we need to have a coherent process. You mentioned the global stocktake in 2023. However, that's just the end point. It is actually about to start with the preparations and will fully start in 2022. So we're looking at 2 years. In terms of the methods, we're very happy to see this year's Adaptation Gap Report because it brings us closer to getting a better understanding of how to assess not just progress on the goal, but also on the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation. In terms of the inputs, one of the primary inputs is adaptation communications by parties in which they outline what kind of impacts they're facing and how they're addressing the problem, but also what kind of gaps and needs are still there, in particular finance. And Peter very ably showed that we're still lacking finance, and Timo showed that on implementation, we're lagging behind. Currently, we're only having 13 adaptation communications from countries, so we need to ramp up that. And finally, on the process, we're looking at having a number of reports and a number of webinars. But what is needed at this point is to create a coherent process to ensure that the reports are complementary and that we first look at aspects of impacts, then of planning, and then of success. So all in all, still a lot to be done, and we're grateful for UNEP and the Gap Report series to supporting us in this endeavor and allowing parties to have the best available science and information in undertaking their stocktake. With that, back to you, Henry.
Thank you, Annette. Just a quick follow-up question. Maybe you can answer that very briefly. So what do you think is most needed in terms of adaptation planning in preparation for the coming task in developing countries? What's most needed? Very quick response, please.
Yes, I think, as we said, finance and implementation. And we have a process under ours that is the national adaptation plans. I mentioned 125 countries are engaging. They need more technical support in order to formulate. But then once they have formulated their plans, they need the financial support to actually implement the priorities. And they were looking for the Global Climate Fund to prepare the necessary policies, but also to simplify access so that developing countries can access the resources they need to address their adaptation priorities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Annette. So my next question goes to Nicholas. What is UNEP doing, or what could UNEP do to support developing countries and other countries in closing some of the gaps that have been identified in the report in terms of planning, finance, and implementation, and potentially also in the context of the nature-based solutions?
Thanks, Henry. I actually consider the Adaptation Gap Report a little bit like a scorecard for UN, because we have, as the UN in whole, we have been heavily involved in working with countries on the planning frame, and obviously finance and implementation are key areas for us as well. So while it's not a one-to-one scorecard for UN, I think that we have done fairly well with the planning frameworks, helping countries to put in place the institutional arrangements, and like perhaps quite a tangible example are early warning systems. So there's quite a number of countries that have been able to put in place quite comprehensive early warning systems. So then let's move to the areas where we still have a long way to go, like the report also says. So what can we do, and what have we been doing to advance and increase the finance that is going into adaptation? Well, there are a couple of things. Like the report is noting that we can't really measure and monitor adaptation and the kind of enhanced resilience that we're trying to build. So if you take any Minister of Finance or national budget allocation process, if you can't measure the benefit of it, it's going to be really difficult to get the money into adaptation. So that's a key area that not only UN but all of us will need to focus on. So bringing together all the scientists and the practitioners, and together with national statistical departments on how do you measure and monitor resilience. Another part is, I think we need to focus more on the adaptation mitigation win-win situations. There are plenty of them. And if the financier is keen on the mitigation side, then we should be able to sell adaptation action also has a mitigation action. And to give you an example, NatureBased Solutions, which also one of the chapters looks at, is a great example where you can deliver both a mitigation and adaptation benefits. That all said, nature-based solutions are not the easiest. So often it's quite location-specific areas and actions. That's my kids coming home. Sorry. So very location-based actions, and it's also quite small scale. So it's hard to draw in the big investors, the BlackRocks of the world, to invest when investment objects in a nature-based solution can be anything from $20,000 to $500,000. It's still small objects for them. So we're working to kind of network those solutions and build up bigger bankable projects and networks of solutions that high-level investors can join. Two more examples on perhaps the adaptation mitigation win-wins. Cooling sector is a great solution for mitigation and obviously thermal comfort, and cool change for agricultural products is a key resilience element as well, both for health and for food security. And if we go over to water security, then just looking at the water distribution system in many countries, so I'm in Kenya, many cities here are losing 30 to even 50% of the water just in the distribution system. And that obviously costs a lot of energy to pump that water back and forth. But
so I'm going to have to stop you, Niklas. We can have more questions, hopefully, and more examples. I'm glad that there are so many, but I'm going to have to move on in the interest of time. What can be expected from the science community in terms of resolving the conceptual, technical, and scientific limitations, challenges in the context of developing a more detailed assessment of adaptation outcomes?
And that's for me. Thank you very much, Henry. That's an easy one, right? So I don't know what can be expected, but I have some ideas about how the science community could contribute to some of these areas. And just because it's Friday afternoon and our heads might be getting a bit heavy, I'm going to try and keep it a little bit more light. So in terms of what can the scientific community do, I see three great roles in helping us on this in this endeavor. And the first one is to be a lighthouse. The second one is to be a watchdog, and the third one is to be a trailblazer. And let me just expand very quickly on these three areas. So in terms of lighthouse, I think, or I hope that the Adaptation Gap Report does part of that job. It's basically on the not so hard nuts to crack to guide both practitioners but also decision makers in terms of how they can better report or inform about their adaptation actions and also, at least to some extent, on the outcomes of those. So, for instance, in Annette's chapter, Annette and colleagues' chapter, they look into adequacy and efficiency. It's something that needs to be addressed in the very short term, and where you can come up with and propose some concrete ways of going about this that can then be inspiring for decision makers and national and teams and others as well. Moving on to the watchdog, that's definitely also a role I see for the Adaptation Gap Reports. It's basically to highlight all of the areas where there are difficult issues, where there are challenges, where we're not making sufficient progress, and also where we face considerable constraints, for instance, in terms of data and so forth. I don't think the scientific community can address all of these, but they can push for solutions. They can push for funding going into, for instance, better information and data systems and so forth, and push for action in other places of the system as well. And then the third role as a trailblazer, that's really when we get to the really hard questions, addressing how do we take uncertainty into account, how do we address time lags between actions and what they result in and so forth, and Alex outlined some of the issues here. And that's where we need really innovative new approaches and suggestions. And I think sort of going beyond what we already have and really proposing new ways. And one of them is one that I hope that we'll be looking more into in upcoming Adaptation Gap Reports, and relies very much on work that Alex is doing as well, to really start from the top level, a little bit like we do or not a little bit, a lot like what we do on mitigation, where we have a more global and integrated model assessment approach to it. Can we use sort of a top-down element to put on top of the more bottom-up stuff that we do to make things come together? I also see one of the initiatives that's also mentioned and highlighted in the report, the Global Adaptation is a mapping initiative, the GAMI, that is in Timo's chapter, where it's really about bringing researchers together, establishing more coherent and comparable approaches to assessing some of these issues. Because that's maybe just to end off, one thing that the scientific community needs to focus more on is how to provide more synthesized assessment and comparable approaches to assessing some of these issues, and basically join efforts. And finally, also bear in mind that many of these questions have been addressed in other situations as well, and especially maybe there on the whole issue of how do we assess the outcomes of development aid overall, which is quite comparable to what we're facing on adaptation. But let me end there.
Great, thank you so much, and it's wonderful parables, lighthouse, watchdog, and trailblazer. We've got work to do. Thank you. Edith, I hope you can hear us. We can't see you, unfortunately, but are you there?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much. Edith, from your perspective, what can be done to better integrate gender aspects into future assessments of the global adaptation gap reports, progress, and why is it so important to do that? I mean, we know that you have a lot of experience in that area.
Yeah, thank you very much, Henry. I know it's an area that I'm passionate about and I've been pushing as well. Let me start with responding to the question, why do I believe that it's critical to integrate the gender aspects in such an important report as the Adaptation Gap Report? And then I will then cover what I think we should do. I think we know quite clearly that climate change impacts are not gender neutral, and that it tends to worsen existing gender inequalities if we don't address the climate impacts from a gender lens. I think we also know, if we look at vulnerability across the gender, men, women, or boys and girls, we know that the level of vulnerability is different. Their roles in society is also very different. And the experiences in terms of the impacts, they experience the impact of climate change very differently. And when you look at the response measures in terms of the needs and priorities are very different. I think the other thing that we know is as people tend to look at gender and then we quickly look at women's economic empowerment, but we know that for sure there's disproportionate effect of climatic impacts on women due to, of course, institutional, social, and political participation issues. But when looking at gender, we really need to look at the impact on the different groups, what are their needs, and how do we respond to those needs. And why is it important? It's important because if we take a gender differentiated approach, it allows us to come up with more robust policies, strategies, and action plans, which are really able to respond to those specific needs and to ensure that we're able to get an overall good outcome. It also helps us remove gender-based, when we remove gender-based inequalities and social inclusion, it enhances the ability of the communities to be able to cope and recover better from disasters. And if I take the example of financing, we know that gender responsive adaptation financing is smart economics. There's a lot of evidence that investment, for example, in women gives you better returns in terms of economic growth across the SDG and investment objectives. And this we've seen through a study that was done by McKinsey actually last year in 2020. As well, we know that there are numerous studies that have shown that credit access to credit for women, you're able to have better productivity, environmental sustainability, as well as confronting the impacts of climate change. But I think it's important when looking at climatic impacts to ensure that we are looking at both men, women, boys, and girls. It's where, in cases where we have inequalities, then we should do more. Now, let me turn to practically what I think we should do as part of the Adaptation Gap Report. I know that there's definitely been progress in terms of gender considerations in the Adaptation Gap Report compared to the past, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I just have three interventions and 3 suggestions. One is, I think we've got an excellent opportunity because the UNFCCC has national gender and climate change focal points across our countries in the world. It's unfortunate, though, that we are now at 42% of UNFCCC member countries who actually designated gender and climate change focal points. Yet we know that we need a robust gender-related evidence base to inform the assessment. So if we formed a partnership with some of these focal points who are actually driving evidence, generation of evidence, many countries are doing gender analysis as they're developing their adaptation plans and their NDCs, but this information is not publicly available. But in partnership with the gender and climate change focal points at the national level, we should be able to have access to this information. The second point is bringing in gender experts from the outset and ensuring that we work with them to compile the information and also to do the assessment and to work across the chapters. And then finally, there's need for specific assessment tools in measuring progress on gender. And the gender experts that we put in can actually develop an assessment framework that would allow us to see if we are looking at progress within adaptation, how then can we do this? So that partnership at the focal point level and bringing in technical gender experts would, I think, take us a long way forward. And I believe that future adaptation reports should actually take us at a higher level in terms of the gender analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edith. That was wonderful. And we are all aware of how difficult and important it is to bring in more gender perspectives in the Adaptation Gap Report and other areas of our work, because it's so rewarding in the end, and it's just good economics. So we have a few questions from the audience, and I would like to invite the other speakers to join us here in this virtual panel. Timo, Alex, Peter, if you can turn on your videos so that the audience can see us all, and then I will pose some questions. There is Alex. Okay, Peter, now I'm going to have to switch my format. Manishka, hi, so that I can still see what's going on. And Timo, I think we're now complete, right? Yes. So my first question goes to Peter on finance. Will future adaptation gap reports also address financing for maladaptation and compare this against adaptation finance? Can one potentially exclude or sort of cut off the other? Peter, quick answers, please. Rather quick.
Rather quick. 2 components to the answer then. I think first, as you also write in the report, we have no idea of how much money goes to maladaptation or how much money is invested in activities that actually increase vulnerability over time. So that's a problematic thing. That's the first one. The second one is, as I mentioned in the presentation, there is this new impetus into this whole sustainable finance discussion, and through the taxonomies and through the disclosure of sustainable finance practices, we do actually hope to get a better overview in the future of investments and their relation towards climate risks, and this should avoid investments into activities that actually increase vulnerability. That still doesn't mean we know how much is invested in maladaptation, but at least it puts it more on the radar, because currently it's one of those issues that is actually extremely important, and we hardly know anything about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. My second question to Timo. So, is it possible to get better information about the outcomes of adaptation projects? And if so, how could that be achieved? Timo.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, it's of course a key challenge to get more information from the projects and what they're actually achieving. Currently, we often have the project proposal documents at the start, and then some overall portfolio indicators, but rarely information on what the projects individually achieved. One of the possibilities could be that funds would make available actual evaluation reports or annual performance reports, as the Green Climate Fund is doing, but has not historically been done. Also rarely done by bilateral development agencies. So that could be a way to get also some more narrative information from each project beyond just the standard indicators. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think we still have a lot of work to do on getting the right indicators to help us understand the connection between results and real outcomes on the ground. And that's really an area where a lot of the work has to take place. Manishka, a question for you. So what are some of the financing resources that you consider innovative and have the potential to help nature-based solutions financing grow?
Thank you, Henry. I think there's been a lot of reliance on development funding, donor funding, and even foundations. And I think while that will continue to be very important, I think there's a real opportunity to harness market-based approaches and the private sector. And a few sources that I personally found had the potential were things like climate bonds. It works really well for mitigation. There are a few examples that include NBS components, but I think that's an area that can really grow. Then there are, the conservation community has been using payments for ecosystems. I think that can be scaled up further. There are insurance-based products. And another aspect is that we really need to blend financing sources, so not just rely on one group, but we can have government along with the private sector coming together to fund some of these. And then we also need enabling frameworks, regulations to ensure that can happen. Thank you.
Great, yeah. Quick answer. And so next question, Alex, going back to the overall sort of context of the report. In your view, what are the main challenges for the next editions of the Adaptation Gap Report? I mean, I should have asked that question at the very end. I realize that now. But anyway, I'll continue the question. To be more specific and concrete in assessing the gap between progress and the progress and the gap, the balance here.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Big question. Actually, we talked about that, and Anne also came back on that. I mean, we need to starting to better understand the real outcomes of what we are doing in terms of adaptation, which is linked to the question on maladaptation that we heard before. So this is a critical step, because building on that and building also on better understanding risk projections at local and national levels, well, then you will have two big pieces of the puzzle to then discuss what are the gaps, what are the trends, what are the maybe the thresholds at one point, the kind of options that are available now or not available, and their efficiency over time. So understanding the outcomes now and in the future, even if that's imperfect, but we can start having some better ideas, but we need some push on that. I mean, for me, this is one of the building blocks of the progress.
Right, great. I really am sorry that the questions aren't in a coherent order, but I'm trying to pose them as they come and also provide a balance across sort of our panel here. Let me ask a question to you, Anna. How could countries be incentivized? This is now the topic that the report focuses on to some degree because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how could countries be incentivized to use COVID-19 recovery plans and stimulus packages for actions that increase support for climate adaptation? you have any thoughts on that.
That's a very good question, and actually it's something that we looked into in more detail in the emissions gap report, where we had a whole chapter which looked into the COVID-19 stimulus packages as they're emerging and how green they are. And I think it would be interesting to do something similar, maybe more on resilience and adaptation, and really try to both identify the options for economic recovery that is both green and resilient, while also, of course, addressing the economic and social concerns that they're intended to address. And also, where do we stand on that right now? Because just as there are many, many options for making or for mitigating emissions through these recoveries, there are also extremely unprecedented opportunities for really trying to hit on some of the pressing priorities, both in terms of poverty, inequality, even gender issues, as Edith talked about before, nature-based solutions, and adaptation and resilience. So I think that would be something very interesting to look into, and maybe that's something we could even consider to look into in the next adaptation gap report, or at least it would be good to do soon, to actually put some pressure on governments, not only to make their COVID packages greener, but also to make them more resilient and more equitable and just.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And Annette, my next question is to you. The report assesses the extent to which countries have been engaging in adaptation planning. However, the implementation chapter does not follow up with assessing the extent to which countries are implementing these plans. So at this stage, is it possible to assess this in a meaningful way? And if not, what data do we need to do this? And maybe after Annette, Timo has some thoughts on that too.
Indeed, a big question. I think one of the problems we noticed, and that some of the countries themselves have been said for years, there is a bias when it comes to international funding. People tend to fund plans rather than the implementation of the actual plan. So what we've seen, for example, with the LDCs, the very first plans we had were the so-called National Adaptation Programs of Action that were established in 2001. Many of the projects therein have been implemented, but not all of them. So then, of course, we now have the national adaptation plans, and countries said, okay, let's focus on them and implement them. However, it's then a problem getting the financial resources to implement the actual plan. But instead, more funding is being made available to produce a second plan rather than to implement the first. So that is one aspect I'd like to highlight. The other, of course, is the lack of monitoring and evaluation, that even though we have the plan itself is very weak on how to actually follow through the plan to see, okay, are we actually implementing it in the right way? And not giving enough incentives for public or private actors to actually implement. You've seen some of the indicators. It doesn't follow through with regulations, and it doesn't necessarily follow through with incentives. And it doesn't always have to be direct investments, but it can also be tax rates, it can be building zones, it can be all sorts of things. But that is lacking. And I think for future gap reports, we need to look at the link between the planning and how do we actually follow through. So in that regard, I'm happy to further discuss with Timo and get his views on it. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you. Timo, you want to add a few more words to that?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, conceptually, one aspect is that the plans are very different in their nature. Some plans have just high-level goals and therefore would be more difficult to assess in terms of their implementation, whereas other NAP documents, national adaptation plans, are very detailed with specific actions or priorities, which could, options, which could be easier to measure. So that's one of the conceptual difficulties, and that's why the implementation chapter didn't directly look at, okay, what did the plans in chapter 3 do? Another very important finding from chapter 3 is, of course, that monitoring and evaluation systems at the national level are mainly missing. So 75% of countries that have an adaptation plan don't actually monitor its implementation, not even at the basic level. That is certainly something where this could be improved. To give you one good practice example is from the UK, where they have an independent commission that's looking into the progress of implementation of the UK adaptation plan. It's reporting directly to Parliament, and the Parliament has to respond. And this mechanism is set in UK's Climate Change Act. So that's a good practice example where there's a direct link between, okay, there's a plan and there's independent monitoring, and the Commission also makes recommendations on how to improve policy making in practice. So that would be a good practice example of what countries could do.
Great, thank you. My next question, Niklas. The LDCs, least developed countries, are committing through their 2050 vision to more adaptation finance to the center of strategic government business through 2030 and longer-term 2050 targets. How can UNEP and other UN agencies help them to achieve that goal?
So first, and it connects a little bit to Annette's question on the innovative finance. If you look at the climate policy initiatives investigations on climate finance, it tends to be that in the range of 70% of the climate finance is used within national areas. So that's one thing that we have to look at, national budgets and the private sector within the country. But obviously for the least developing countries, we'll have to also tap into the various climate funds. So the three funds that also were looked at in these, and there's also an increase in the resources going into there. So the UN system and other agencies that can deliver on green climate fund funding need to channel more of that to the LDCs and have a special focus on helping them with it, because it may be more difficult to get of the private sector investment and from national budgets as well, because those budgets are already constrained. Back to you, Henry.
Thank you. Let me just follow up that question with to Edith. In her view as from the African Development Bank, how do you think, Edith, can international development banks, multilateral development banks, and other finance institutions support this process?
Yeah, thank you very much, Henry. I think I want to pick on a point that was raised in terms of blended financing. I just mentioned that within the bank, we are looking at innovative mechanisms to fund adaptation, because we know that unlike mitigation, giving a value to adaptation is very challenging, and really articulating the benefits in a tangible way. So we're putting together the adaptation benefit mechanism, which is responding to Article 6.8, which is giving adaptation a value and financing based on tangible results. And we're already rolling out some case studies in Ivory Coast, for example, in cocoa, and in a number of countries, and developing a mechanism where you're actually able to attract private financing, so that when we're looking at blended financing, we should not just look at the global climate funds and multilateral development banks, but also bringing in the private sector, but also some of the national funds as well. The second point I wanted to raise is the point that Anne brought up in terms of what's the impact of COVID-19 in terms of climate financing. And we've been doing quite a robust analysis looking at the support that's been given in the last year on COVID-19 response measures. And it's interesting that in terms of greening, a lot of emphasis went into resilience building, because you will remember that COVID was running concurrently with climate impacts. We had floods, we had locust invasion in East Africa. So a number of the measures were also putting in place, not only addressing the pandemic, but also trying to build resilience. So we are currently in the throes of doing that analysis, but our initial findings are quite interesting in terms of areas where we saw that there's quite a bit of effort, for example, in building health system resilience, in looking at disaster risk management, but interestingly as well, climate smart agriculture as an example, and as well protecting jobs. So when we are looking at protecting jobs, what about green jobs as well? So we have a lot of opportunities, even in some of these in crisis situations, to actually bring to the fore issues of building resilience, so that we don't just address the challenges now, because we know climate is getting even more difficult in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edith. And I think it's a really important point you just made here in terms of what we need to be doing. We only have a few minutes left, so let me give one last question to Manishka regarding nature-based solutions. So, and this is an interesting one. What role does securing property rights for indigenous people play in conserving ecosystems? Can you just add a little bit to that question? It's a bit from a different angle, but it's important.
Property rights are vital, because if property rights are not secured, the groups that can potentially benefit from financing and from ecosystem sort of benefits that could even be extraction, they can't fully materialize that. And with a lot of conservation issues, for a long time, the focus was on sort of really focusing on protecting nature. And I think with NBS and with climate change and the attention that it's getting globally, there's more of a recognition that indigenous groups, marginalized groups, really need to be at the forefront of it, and that's being recognized more and more. So I think it's very important. Land tenure and issues like that really vary across the world. So that's where regulations can be important, and also really one weakness, especially in some developing countries, is that adaptation is a relatively new area, and sometimes regulations don't even address adaptation in an effective way. So when we talk about legal mechanisms, policy mechanisms, really recognizing those rights will be sort of foundational in protecting those rights and making sure that the benefits that come from NBS are also shared amongst those groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Manishka. I think that's a really important point to make, that there are beneficiaries, and we need to make sure that indigenous peoples and other vulnerable groups also benefit properly from these solutions, and that these solutions particularly benefit when implemented well different groups and have a lot of benefits besides reducing climate risks. So unfortunately, we don't have more time, although we have more questions, but we're going to have to slowly end the panel and the questions. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time and their really insightful answers to the questions from the audience. And I will just briefly summarize a few points from this webinar to close down the event altogether. So, I mean, I'll keep it short. I think, from the report in general and the focus on nature-based solutions, I think one of the key messages is that we have made progress in planning, in finance, in implementation, in all areas. There's progress made, but we need to scale up the action in all these areas to avoid that the adaptation gap, which we can see in all these areas, in finance, in planning, and in implementation, does not grow. And there are indications that it's growing, but we need to ramp up the investment to avoid that. We need to acknowledge that adaptation is a really, really important measure in the context of climate actions, together with mitigation, to avoid increasing costs, damages, and losses, and to increase the resilience against climate risks. Failing to do so will lead to much, much higher losses and damages in the future. And investment in adaptation really is good economic practice. The costs of adaptation investment are much lower than the losses of avoid or not having invested in them. And the same goes for mitigation. Mitigation investments pay off not only in avoiding climate change, but the costs that we avoid by going along a lower temperature trajectory, one that doesn't lead us to high levels of climate change, will have major benefits in terms of adaptation in the future. And with that, I think I will stop here. I think these are key messages that we can take forward. We need to now focus on the next edition of the Adaptation Gap Report, which we hopefully will be able to launch at COP26 in Glasgow. That is yet to be planned. The contents exactly are yet to be planned. We have a framework. We have a good writing team, I think, and we are all looking forward to continuing this work in the future. I would like to end here and thank all the panelists, the speakers, the audience for joining us today, and I'll hand over to Lars to close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry, and just a big thank you from me as well. Thank you to all the participants, and thanks to speakers and panelists for lending their time. And just to mention, and I know that a few people have asked for this, the recording will be available shortly through UNEP's website. We just need to do some editing, but early next week there should be a recording available. So with that, I think I'll close down. Thank you to all, and goodbye.